a small cabin near Colorado's wilderness. Ethan Carter rescues a mysterious puppy during a storm and names it Shadow. Over time, Ethan discovers that Shadow isn't just any stray but a hybrid, a mix of wolf, coyote, and dog. This revelation sparks a heart-wrenching journey as Ethan must decide what's best for Shadow, keeping him as a companion or allowing him to embrace his wild instincts. Ethan ultimately chooses to release Shadow into the wild, trusting him to thrive among his kind. Shadow's departure becomes the catalyst for Ethan to reflect on humanity's relationship with nature. Through his blog and collaborations with conservationists, Ethan turns Shadow's story into a powerful movement, advocating for wildlife protection, coexistence, and respect for the delicate balance between humans and nature. Shadow's legacy lives on in the wilderness and in the hearts of those touched by his tale. Ethan learns that love isn't about possession but about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Are you watching from the US, Canada, or somewhere else? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Shadow's journey and your perspectives on wildlife conservation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, DG Story, for more compelling stories like this. Your support means everything to us. The rain poured relentlessly, a curtain of silver that blanketed the winding mountain road leading to Boulder Creek, Colorado. Ethan Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old Jeep Wrangler, his headlights struggling to cut through the downpour. It was a drive he knew well, a route that wound past towering pines and jagged rocks. But tonight, the familiar path felt treacherous. The storm had turned the dirt shoulders into a slick mess, and visibility was limited to a few feet ahead. Ethan was eager to get home. A day spent hiking the trails of the Rocky Mountains had left him physically drained but mentally refreshed. A much-needed escape from the deadlines and screen time that defined his work as a freelance graphic designer. Home meant warmth, a hot shower, and the comforting solitude of his cabin nestled at the base of the mountains. Then he saw it, a dark, motionless shape near the edge of the road. His foot instinctively eased off the gas, and his brow furrowed as he leaned forward to get a better look. "What the?" he muttered, pulling the Jeep to a stop on the narrow shoulder. Rain drummed against the roof as he grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him immediately, seeping through his jacket as he splashed through shallow puddles toward the shape. The beam of his flashlight swept across the wet asphalt and settled on a small, shivering figure huddled beneath a drooping bush. It let out a faint, pitiful whimper that made Ethan's chest tighten. It was a puppy, or at least it looked like one, tiny, drenched, and trembling. Mud clung to its matted fur, and its oversized ears twitched as Ethan approached. "Hey there, buddy," Ethan said softly, crouching down a few feet away. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The creature flinched at his voice but didn't try to run. His wide, glassy eyes locked onto him, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Ethan's heart broke. Carefully, he shrugged off his raincoat and held it out, a makeshift barrier between the animal and the storm. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. Let's get you somewhere warm." Slowly, the puppy inched forward, its movements hesitant but driven by the promise of safety. When it was close enough, Ethan gently wrapped the raincoat around it and scooped it into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, its tiny frame almost weightless. The puppy let out a soft whine but didn't resist. Ethan hurried back to the Jeep, shielding the animal as best he could from the driving rain. Once inside, he cranked up the heat and placed the bundle on the passenger seat. The puppy curled into the coat, the shivering gradually subsiding. Ethan reached out and gave it a reassuring pat on the head. "You're safe now," he said. "Let's get you home." The cabin was a welcome sight, its warm yellow light cutting through the oppressive darkness of the storm. Ethan parked the Jeep and carried the bundled puppy inside, careful to keep it shielded from the rain. The familiar scent of cedarwood and faint traces of coffee greeted him as he shut the door behind them, setting the bundle down gently on an old plaid armchair near the fireplace. Ethan moved quickly to start a fire. Soon, the room was filled with a crackling warmth. the kind that seemed to soak into your bones and push away every chill. The puppy, still cocooned in the raincoat, peered out cautiously, its large ears twitching as it took in the new surroundings. "You're safe now," Ethan said, crouching by the chair. He reached out and carefully pulled back the coat, revealing the puppy's drenched, matted fur. It let out a soft whimper but didn't resist as Ethan began drying it with a clean towel. "Let's get you cleaned up." "Ha!" As the fur began to fluff up, Ethan noticed its unusual coloration, a mix of gray, black, and tawny brown swirled together in a pattern he didn't recognize. The puppy's wide, expressive eyes, a deep amber, seemed almost too intelligent, following his every movement with unnerving focus. Ethan chuckled softly. "You've got some character, don't you?" Finished with the towel, he stood and went to the kitchen. He poured a bowl of warm milk and added a few scraps of leftover chicken, placing it carefully on the floor near the fire. The puppy hesitated, sniffing the air, before inching forward and devouring the meal with surprising intensity. Ethan watched, arms crossed, a soft smile on his face. "Hungry, huh? Can't blame you for that." Once it had finished eating, the puppy curled up near the fire, its tiny body rising and falling with steady breaths. Ethan sat back on the couch, watching the creature with a mix of curiosity and relief. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, a world away from the chaos. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself wondering about the little stranger. Where had it come from? How had it ended up alone on the side of the road in such a terrible storm? These questions lingered in his mind as he prepared for bed. But one thing was certain, for tonight, Shadow, as he'd decided to name it, was safe. Tomorrow, he'd take it to the vet to see if anyone was missing a puppy. For now, though, he let the steady rhythm of the rain lull him to sleep, content in the knowledge that he had done something good. Shadow's presence brought a new kind of energy to Ethan's cabin. Over the next few days, the once quiet home bustled with activity. Ethan had quickly fallen into a routine, feeding Shadow, taking it outside to explore the snowy yard, and spending evenings by the fire while Shadow dozed on his lap. Yet, the more time they spent together, the more Ethan noticed things that didn't quite add up. First, it was small, almost inconsequential details. Shadow refused to play with the squeaky toy Ethan had bought at the general store. Instead, it seemed fascinated by the windows, his gaze always fixed on the trees beyond. Ethan chalked it up to curiosity. Perhaps the pup wasn't used to being indoors. But then, there were the noises at night. Ethan would wake to hear Shadow pacing the wooden floors, its nails clicking softly. Occasionally, it let out low, guttural sounds that didn't resemble the yips or whines of a puppy. They were deeper, almost primal, sending a chill down Ethan's spine. He told himself it was nothing. Shadow was likely adjusting to its new surroundings. One morning, while preparing coffee, Ethan glanced out the window and saw Shadow standing in the middle of the yard. It was perfectly still, its ears perked and its body rigid. Following Shadow's line of sight, Ethan noticed a flock of birds perched in the trees, as if sensing his presence. Shadow turned its head, locking eyes with Ethan. The intensity in its amber gaze was startling. It wasn't the look of a playful pup. It was something else entirely. "You're an odd little thing, aren't you?" Ethan muttered, shaking his head. He opened the door to call Shadow back inside, but the pup hesitated. For a moment, it seemed torn, glancing between the woods and Ethan. Finally, trotted back to the cabin, his tail low. The incident lingered in Ethan's mind for the rest of the day. He decided it was time to visit the vet. If Shadow belonged to someone, they might have answers, and if not, at least he could ensure the pup was healthy. But deep down, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Shadow wasn't an ordinary stray. Something about its behavior was different. The vet clinic was a modest building on the edge of town, its exterior painted in calming shades of green and beige. Ethan had called ahead and made an appointment, arriving early to avoid the usual rush. as he stepped inside with Shadow on a leash. The smell of antiseptic and the faint sound of barking greeted him. The receptionist, a cheerful woman in her mid-30s named Dana, smiled warmly. "Good morning. You must be Ethan. And this little one must be Shadow." Ethan nodded. "That's right. Found him a few days ago on the side of the road. Thought I'd bring him in to make sure he's okay and see if anyone might be missing him." Dana leaned over the counter, her eyes softening as she looked at Shadow. "Well, aren't you a handsome boy?" she cooed. Shadow, however, didn't respond like most dogs would. Instead of wagging his tail or sniffing curiously, he stood still, his amber eyes fixed on Dana with an unreadable expression. Ethan noticed the awkward pause and gave Shadow a gentle pat. "He's a bit shy," he explained. "No problem," Dana said, though a flicker of something hesitation, perhaps, crossed her face. "Dr. Harper will see you in just a moment. You can have a seat." Ethan guided Shadow to a chair in the waiting area. Around them, the room buzzed with activity. A golden retriever wagged its tail excitedly. A cat meowed indignantly from its carrier, and a young boy giggled as his dachshund licked his face. Shadow, however, remained completely unfazed, his gaze darting around the room with calculated precision. Finally, their name was called, and Ethan led Shadow into the examination room. Dr. Harper, a kind-faced woman in her late 40s, greeted them with a professional but warm demeanor. "So, this is Shadow?" she asked, crouching slightly to get a closer look. Ethan nodded. "Yep, found him during a storm a few days ago. I just want to make sure he's healthy, and maybe figure out if he has an owner." Dr. Harper examined Shadow carefully, starting with his coat and teeth. As her hands moved over his body, her brows knitted slightly. "He's in good condition for a stray," she noted, but there was a hint of curiosity in her tone. "And these markings, they're unusual. Do you mind if we run a quick scan for a microchip?" Ethan agreed, and Dr. Harper retrieved a scanner. She ran it over Shadow's neck and shoulders, but the device emitted no sound. "No chip," she confirmed. "Well, let's take his weight and temperature, and I'll do a quick blood test to check for any underlying issues." Shadow complied surprisingly well throughout the examination, his body tense but still. Dr. Harper continued to make small notes, occasionally glancing at Ethan. "You said you found him near the road?" she asked. "That's right, just outside of town," Ethan replied. "Why? Is something wrong?" Dr. Harper hesitated before answering. "No, nothing wrong. It's just his features don't quite match any breed I'm familiar with. And these eyes," she trailed off, looking into Shadow's amber gaze. "They're striking." As the examination wrapped up, Dr. Harper handed Ethan a small packet of supplements for Shadow. "He seems healthy overall," she said, "but I'd recommend keeping an eye on his behavior. If anything seems unusual, feel free to bring him back in." Ethan thanked her and left the clinic, feeling both relieved and more curious than ever. Back in the Jeep, he glanced at Shadow, who sat calmly in the passenger seat, staring out the window. "Well, buddy," Ethan said, starting the engine, "looks like you're officially mine for now." The drive home was uneventful, but Ethan couldn't shake Dr. Harper's words from his mind. Shadow's unusual features and behavior had sparked questions he didn't yet have answers to. What kind of stray had he brought into his life? Over the next week, Shadow's peculiarities became harder to ignore. The low, guttural noises at night continued, now accompanied by occasional pacing in front of the windows. During their walks in the woods, Shadow often stopped abruptly, his ears twitching as if he sensed something Ethan couldn't see. One evening, while sitting by the fire, Ethan decided to do some research. He opened his laptop and typed in descriptions of Shadow's appearance and behavior. Amber eyes, unusual coat pattern, guttural sounds. The search results were inconclusive, but one thread on a wildlife forum caught his eye. It detailed sightings of hybrid animals in remote areas, creatures that displayed characteristics of both domestic and wild species. Ethan frowned, scrolling through the posts. The idea seemed far-fetched, but something about it resonated. Could Shadow be one of these hybrids? And if so, how had he ended up on the side of the road in a storm? Shadow, curled up at Ethan's feet, stirred as if sensing his thoughts. He looked up, his amber eyes glinting in the firelight. Ethan reached down, running a hand through the pup's thick fur. "Guess we'll figure it out together." "Ha!" he murmured. Ethan's quiet life took a dramatic turn when he received an unexpected email one morning. The subject line read, "Regarding your unusual pet." First, he assumed it was spam, but curiosity got the better of him. Opening the email, he found a message from someone named Dr. Lena Grant, a researcher at the Colorado Wildlife Institute. The email read, "Mr. Carter, I came across your blog post about Shadow and was struck by your descriptions of his behavior and appearance. Based on what you've shared, I believe Shadow may not be an ordinary stray. His traits suggest a possibility that he could be a hybrid /U2014A mix between a domestic dog and a wild species. These hybrids are rare, but they have been known to occur in areas near wildlife corridors. I would be happy to help you identify Shadow's lineage and determine the best course of action. Please let me know if you're interested. Sincerely, Dr. Lena Grant." Ethan sat back in his chair, the words blurring in his mind. A hybrid? The idea was both thrilling and unsettling. It explained Shadow's peculiar traits, but it also raised questions Ethan wasn't ready to face. What if Shadow wasn't meant to be a pet? What if keeping him was dangerous /U2014 for both of them? That evening, Ethan decided to contact Dr. Grant. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to involve anyone else in his bond with Shadow. But as he watched the pup pacing in front of the window again, his amber eyes glowing in the dim light, Ethan knew he needed answers. 2 days later, Dr. Grant arrived at Ethan's cabin. She was a tall woman with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. Shadow, usually wary of strangers, surprised Ethan by approaching her cautiously, sniffing her outstretched hand before sitting at her feet. "He's magnificent," Dr. Grant said, crouching to examine him more closely. "I can see why you were intrigued. May I?" Ethan nodded, watching as Dr. Grant performed a series of checks, similar to what Dr. Harper had done. Her observations, however, were far more detailed. She measured Shadow's proportions, took notes on his coat pattern, and even recorded the sounds he made when she touched certain spots on his body. After an hour of meticulous observation, Dr. Grant stood up and turned to Ethan. "Shadow's features and behavior strongly suggest wild ancestry, based on his markings and build. I'd say he's likely part coyote or even part wolf." Ethan's heart sank. "Wolf? Are you serious?" Dr. Grant nodded. "It's rare, but it happens. Hybridization often occurs in areas where human encroachment disrupts natural habitats. Animals like Shadow are the result of blurred boundaries between the wild and the domestic." Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter, letting Dr. Grant's words sink in. Shadow, a hybrid of wolf or coyote? The thought was equal parts awe-inspiring and terrifying. His mind raced with questions. Could Shadow be dangerous? Was Ethan equipped to care for him? Most importantly, what did this mean for their future together? "I've lived with him for weeks now," Ethan finally said, his voice tinged with hesitation. "He's never shown any aggression. If anything, he's been protective. But I can't deny there's something wild about him." Dr. Grant nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's typical of hybrids. They inherit a mix of traits from both parents. Shadow's behavior /U2014, his alertness, his pacing, even the sounds he makes /U2014 are signs of his wild instincts. But his bond with you shows his domesticated side. These animals walk a fine line." Ethan glanced at Shadow, who lay by the fire, his amber eyes half closed but still vigilant. "What should I do? Should I keep him? Or does he need to be somewhere else?" Dr. Grant hesitated. choosing her words carefully. Legally, hybrids like Shadow exist in a gray area. Some states require permits to keep them. Others consider them wild animals that belong in sanctuaries. I can help you navigate the regulations. But the bigger question is whether it's best for Shadow to stay here. He's bonded with you, which is rare and special. But his needs /you 2014 physical and behavioral /you 2014 may become more challenging as he grows. The words hit Ethan like a gut punch. He had grown attached to Shadow in ways he hadn't fully realized until now. Letting him go felt unthinkable. But keeping him if it wasn't right for Shadow would be equally hard to live with. That night, Ethan stayed up late, watching Shadow as he slept by the fireplace. Questions swirled in his mind. What kind of life could he offer Shadow? Would a sanctuary truly be better for him? And what if keeping Shadow meant putting them both at risk? As if sensing Ethan's turmoil, Shadow stirred and padded over to him. He rested his head on Ethan's knee, letting out a soft, almost comforting sound. Ethan ran a hand through his thick fur. "I don't know what to do, buddy," he whispered, "but I promise I'll figure it out." The next morning, Ethan called Dr. Grant and agreed to have Shadow undergo a genetic test. "If nothing else," Ethan said, "it'll give us a clearer picture of who /you 2014 or what /you 2014 he really is." Dr. Grant returned the following day with a DNA kit. The process was simple: a quick swab of Shadow's cheek, which Shadow tolerated with surprising calm. "We'll have the results in about a week," Dr. Grant said as she packed up the kit. "In the meantime, keep observing him. His behavior will tell you a lot." The week waiting for the DNA results felt like an eternity. Shadow's behavior seemed to intensify as if he sensed the growing tension. He paced more often at night, his sharp ears twitching at every faint sound outside the cabin. On 2 separate occasions, Ethan woke in the middle of the night to find Shadow standing by the front door, his body stiff, his amber eyes focused on the dark forest beyond. Ethan started double-checking the locks and even moved a chair against the door as a makeshift barricade. Though Shadow showed no signs of aggression, the idea of his wild ancestry loomed over Ethan like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. 3 days before the results were due, something happened that shattered the fragile calm Ethan had managed to maintain. It was late in the evening, and Ethan was preparing dinner when Shadow, who had been lying quietly near the fire, suddenly bolted to the window. His low growl reverberated through the room, a sound Ethan had never heard before. It wasn't a playful bark or a defensive snarl. It was primal, guttural, and filled with an edge of warning. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, setting down the knife and moving cautiously toward the window. He peered out into the darkness, but the forest beyond the yard was silent and still. Shadow's growling didn't stop. Instead, it grew louder as he moved to the front door, his body tense and his ears flat against his head. Ethan's pulse quickened. He grabbed the flashlight he kept on the counter and carefully opened the door. Stepping onto the porch, Shadow stayed by his side, his growls deep and continuous. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the yard. For a moment, Ethan saw nothing unusual, but then, just beyond the tree line, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him. Ethan froze. The eyes didn't belong to a deer or a raccoon. He'd seen enough wildlife to know the difference. They were low to the ground, piercing and predatory. Whatever it wasn't small. Shadow took a step forward, his growls turning into sharp, warning barks. "Get inside," Ethan whispered, pulling Shadow gently by the collar. The animal resisted at first, his focus locked on the glowing eyes, but finally relented and followed Ethan back into the cabin. Ethan bolted the door and pulled the curtains shut, his heart pounding. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Ethan couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes. Was it a wolf, a coyote, or something else entirely? More troubling was Shadow's reaction. Had he recognized the creature? Was it a part of his past? Ethan spent the next day in a fog, distracted by what he had seen. He debated calling Dr. Grant, but without more information, he wasn't sure what to say. He resolved to wait for the DNA results, hoping they would bring some clarity. The long-awaited email from Dr. Grant arrived late in the evening, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the cabin. Ethan opened it immediately, his fingers trembling as he clicked on the attachment containing Shadow's DNA results. He scanned the report, his eyes darting from line to line until they landed on the words that made his stomach drop. Primary lineage: 60% Canis lupus, wolf; 30% Canis latrans, coyote; 10% Canis familiaris, domestic dog. Ethan stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Shadow wasn't just a hybrid, he was predominantly wild. The realization hit like a thunderclap. Shadow's behavior, his instincts, his uncanny intelligence, it all made sense now. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, as if sensing Ethan's turmoil. Shadow approached and rested his head on Ethan's lap. His amber eyes gazed up, calm and trusting, a stark contrast to the storm raging in Ethan's mind. "What am I supposed to do with you?" Ethan whispered. Ethan called Dr. Grant the next morning. "I got the results," he said, his voice tight. "I figured you would," she replied. "I know this must be overwhelming, but you need to make a decision soon. Ethan, Shadow's wild instincts will only grow stronger as he matures. If you're going to keep him, you'll need to take serious precautions. And if you choose to let him go, we need to act quickly to find him a suitable sanctuary." The thought of letting Shadow go was unbearable, but keeping him now felt irresponsible. Ethan spent the next 2 days in agonizing deliberation, torn between his bond with Shadow and the reality of what was best for him. The breaking point came on the third night. Ethan woke abruptly to the sound of Shadow barking, sharp, loud, and urgent. He bolted out of bed and ran to the living room, where Shadow stood at the window, his body rigid. "What is it now?" Ethan muttered, his voice thick with sleep. But when he looked outside, his blood ran cold. A group of coyotes stood just beyond the tree line, their silhouettes illuminated by the moonlight. Shadow barked again, his tone shifting from alarm to something Ethan hadn't heard before: recognition. One of the coyotes stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Shadow turned to Ethan, his amber eyes filled with something Ethan could only describe as longing. Ethan's chest tightened. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You belong here, with me." Shadow turned back to the window, his body trembling with tension. The lead coyote let out a long, haunting howl, and Shadow's ears perked. The sound seemed to stir something deep within him. Without thinking, Ethan unlatched the door and opened it slightly. "Go," he whispered, his voice breaking. "If this is where you're meant to be, then go." Shadow hesitated for a moment, looking back at Ethan one last time. Then, with a low whine, he stepped through the door and disappeared into the night. Ethan stood on the porch for what felt like hours, listening to the distant howls fade into the forest. A profound emptiness settled over him, but deep down, he knew he had made the right decision. Shadow was wild at heart, and he deserved to live freely, even if it meant leaving Ethan behind. The days following Shadow's departure were some of the loneliest Ethan had ever experienced. The cabin, once filled with the sounds of Shadow's movements and the quiet companionship they shared, now felt eerily silent. Ethan found himself staring at the empty space by the fireplace where Shadow used to lie, his mind replaying the moment Shadow disappeared into the woods. Despite the emptiness, Ethan knew he had done the right thing. Shadow was where he belonged, among his kind, in the vast wilderness that called to him. Yet, a part of Ethan couldn't help but wonder, was Shadow safe? Was he thriving? Did he remember the bond they shared? To keep himself busy, Ethan threw himself into his work and spent more time outdoors, hiking the trails he and Shadow had once explored together. The forest, once a place of solace, now felt bittersweet. Every rustle of leaves or distant howl made Ethan pause, hoping, even if irrationally, that Shadow might appear again. One afternoon, Weeks after Shadow's departure, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Grant. "I wanted to check in," she said, her tone warm. "How are you holding up?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'm managing," he said finally. "It's been quiet, but I know I made the right decision." "I know it couldn't have been easy," Dr. Grant said, "but I think you'd like to know. There have been sightings of a hybrid pack in the area. One of the descriptions matches Shadow. It seems he's doing well." The news sent a wave of relief washing over Ethan. "A pack?" he repeated, his voice soft. "Yes," Dr. Grant confirmed. "It's rare, but it happens. Hybrids sometimes form their own groups when they don't fit neatly into either world. It sounds like Shadow has found his place." Ethan thanked her and hung up, a bittersweet smile playing on his lips. Shadow was thriving, carving out a life for himself in the wild. It was all Ethan could have hoped for, even if it came with the pain of loss. That evening, Ethan sat on his porch, gazing at the horizon as the sun dipped below the mountains. The forest felt alive, the sounds carrying a new resonance. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a sense of peace. Shadow's departure had left a hole in his life, but it had also taught him something profound. Love wasn't about possession or control. It was about doing what was best for those you cared for, even if it hurt. In the weeks that followed, Ethan found new ways to honor the bond he had shared with Shadow. His hikes became more intentional, a way to reconnect with the wilderness that had brought Shadow into his life. He started photographing the landscapes and wildlife he encountered, capturing the beauty of the world Shadow now called home. One day, while trekking deeper into the forest than usual, Ethan stumbled upon something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a series of paw prints, larger than a domestic dog's but smaller than a full-grown wolf's. The tracks were fresh, leading toward a stream nearby. Ethan crouched, his heart racing as he studied them. "Shadow?" he whispered to the still air, a glimmer of hope stirring in his chest. He followed the tracks cautiously, his breath catching as he reached the edge of the stream. The water reflected the sunlight, and just across the bank, Ethan caught a glimpse of movement. A figure emerged from the trees, sleek, powerful, and unmistakably Shadow. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. Shadow stood on the opposite side of the stream, his amber eyes locking onto Ethan's. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Ethan's instinct was to call out, but he held back, unsure if it was the right thing to do. Shadow tilted his head, his ears twitching as he regarded Ethan. He looked healthy, his coat glistening in the sunlight, his posture confident. Behind him, the faint movement of other figures in the trees suggested he wasn't alone. The hybrid pack. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, seeing Shadow thriving in the wild, surrounded by others like him, filled Ethan with a mix of pride and sadness. He raised a hand in a silent gesture of farewell, not daring to disrupt the balance Shadow had found. To his surprise, Shadow responded with a low, familiar whine. It wasn't the sound of longing or confusion. It was a sound of recognition. Shadow took a step forward, his gaze steady and calm. "It's okay," Ethan said softly, his voice almost carried away by the gentle breeze. "You're where you're supposed to be." Shadow lingered a moment longer before turning back toward the forest. With a final glance over his shoulder, he disappeared into the trees, leaving Ethan standing by the stream with tears welling in his eyes. That encounter left Ethan feeling both lighter and more resolved. Shadow had found his place, and it was clear that he hadn't forgotten their bond. The forest, once a place of uncertainty, now felt like a bridge between their two worlds. As Ethan made his way back to the cabin, he couldn't help but smile. Shadow's spirit lived on in the wilderness, and though they were apart, their connection remained unbroken. The encounter by the stream stayed with Ethan, etched into his memory like a vivid painting. Every detail, the glint of sunlight on the water, Shadow's amber gaze, the quiet acknowledgement between them, felt like a chapter in a story that had come full circle. It didn't erase the ache of missing Shadow, But it gave Ethan something just as powerful: closure. Back at the cabin, Ethan began to channel his feelings into his photography and writing. His blog, once a casual outlet for sharing his hikes and small-town musings, transformed into a platform where he chronicled his journey with Shadow. He wrote about the night he found him in the storm, their weeks together, and the bittersweet decision to let him go. Each post resonated deeply with readers, many of whom shared their own stories of love, loss, and letting go. Months passed, and the forest began to shift with the seasons. The snow melted, giving way to the fresh greens of spring. Ethan spent more time outdoors, exploring new trails and revisiting old ones. Though Shadow no longer walked by his side, Ethan felt his presence in subtle ways: a rustle in the underbrush, a distant howl at dusk, the paw prints that occasionally appeared along his path. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan found himself sitting on the porch, sipping coffee. The quiet was comforting, no longer a reminder of loss but a space for reflection. As he stared out at the forest, he thought of all that Shadow had taught him: the importance of trust, the courage to make hard choices, and the beauty of letting go. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound in the distance, a howl, long and resonant, carried on the wind. Ethan froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was faint, but unmistakable. A small smile crept across his face. Whether it was Shadow or one of his packmates, Ethan couldn't say for sure, but it didn't matter. The howl was a reminder that Shadow was out there, living the life he was meant to lead. In time, Ethan's blog gained traction, drawing attention from nature enthusiasts and wildlife advocates. Dr. Grant even invited him to speak at a seminar about hybrid species, where he shared his experience with Shadow and the lessons it had taught him. The opportunity allowed Ethan to turn his personal journey into something meaningful, inspiring others to respect the delicate balance between humanity and the wild. As the years went by, Shadow remained a part of Ethan's life, not physically, but as a symbol of growth, resilience, and connection. The cabin, once a quiet retreat, became a place filled with stories and memories, where every corner held a reminder of the pup who had changed everything. One day, as Ethan hiked a familiar trail, he stopped at the stream where he had last seen Shadow. The sunlight danced on the water, and the forest hummed with life. Closing his eyes, Ethan breathed deeply, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Thank you," he whispered to the wind, his voice barely audible. And though the forest gave no reply, Ethan felt an unshakable certainty. Shadow was home, and so was he. Shadow's story, as Ethan reflected on it, wasn't just about a bond between a man and a hybrid animal. It became a powerful lens through which larger questions about humanity's relationship with nature emerged. As Ethan shared his experiences more widely through his blog and talks, he found himself at the center of discussions that challenged people's perspectives on wildlife, conservation, and the meaning of coexistence. The first debate that surfaced was about hybrid animals like Shadow. Were they creatures of nature, or unintended consequences of human encroachment into wild habitats? Dr. Grant, who continued to work closely with Ethan, explained that hybrids often emerged in areas where humans had disrupted natural ecosystems. Wolves and coyotes, facing shrinking territories and dwindling food sources, sometimes crossed paths with domestic dogs, resulting in animals like Shadow. Ethan often grappled with this idea. On one hand, Shadow's existence was a testament to nature's adaptability. On the other, it was a reminder of humanity's impact on the natural world. "When I look at Shadow," Ethan wrote in one of his blog posts, "I see resilience and survival, but I also see a reflection of our responsibility as stewards of this planet. Hybrids like him don't just happen, they're born of circumstances we've created." This post sparked a wave of responses. Some readers saw Shadow as a symbol of hope, proof that life finds a way even in the face of adversity. Others viewed his existence as a warning, a sign that humans were pushing nature to its limits. The second major topic of debate revolved around the ethics of keeping wild or hybrid animals as pets. Ethan's decision to let Shadow return to the wild resonated deeply with many, but it also raised challenging questions. Was it ever acceptable to keep such animals in domestic settings? And if not, what alternatives were there for creatures that didn't fully belong in either world? One of Ethan's followers, a wildlife advocate, wrote, "Shadow was lucky to find someone like you, Ethan, but for every Shadow, there are countless hybrids that end up abandoned, abused, or misunderstood. What do we do for them?" This comment stayed with Ethan. He reached out to Dr. Grant, who had been studying hybrid species for years. Together, they began exploring solutions, from sanctuaries designed specifically for hybrids to community education programs that taught people how to coexist with wildlife safely and respectfully. Ethan's blog became a platform for these discussions, fostering a community of readers who were deeply invested in Shadow's story and the broader issues it represented. Through interviews, guest posts, and reader submissions, Ethan cultivated a space where people could share their experiences and ideas. As Ethan's story reached a wider audience, another critical debate emerged: the boundaries between conservation and intervention. Shadow's tale highlighted the delicate balance between human involvement and allowing nature to take its course. Many readers admired Ethan's decision to release Shadow, viewing it as a selfless act that prioritized the animal's well-being. However, others questioned whether letting Shadow go was truly the best decision. One email Ethan received encapsulated this dilemma. "Ethan, I've been following your story and deeply respect your love for Shadow, but I can't help wondering, was releasing him into the wild truly the best option? Hybrids like Shadow don't fully belong in the wilderness or the human world. Couldn't keeping him have ensured his safety and longevity?" Ethan understood these concerns but felt strongly about his choice. In a follow-up blog post, he wrote, "Letting Shadow go was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the most necessary. He wasn't just a companion. He was a creature of the wild, with instincts and needs I could never fully satisfy in a domestic setting. By releasing him, I wasn't abandoning him. I was trusting him to follow the path nature intended." This sparked heated discussions in the blog's comment section, with readers debating the ethics of releasing hybrids versus keeping them in controlled environments. Some argued that sanctuaries were a safer option, providing hybrids with a semblance of freedom while ensuring their protection. Others felt that attempts to control hybrids undermined their autonomy and natural instincts. Ethan and Dr. Grant decided to organize a virtual panel discussion on the topic, inviting experts in wildlife conservation, hybrid behavior, and ethics. The event drew hundreds of attendees, each bringing unique perspectives. One panelist, a wildlife rehabilitator, argued that hybrids like Shadow were living symbols of the blurred lines between humans and nature. "They force us to confront our impact on the environment," she said. "The real question isn't whether we should intervene, but how we can prevent the conditions that create hybrids in the first place." Another panelist, a sanctuary director, shared stories of hybrids struggling to adapt in captivity. "Even in the best sanctuaries, there's something missing, something wild that we can't replicate. We have to remember that no matter how much we love them, these creatures are not pets. They belong to a world beyond ours." Ethan found himself reflecting deeply on these discussions. Shadow's story wasn't just about one hybrid. It was a microcosm of humanity's relationship with nature. By stepping into Shadow's life, Ethan had become part of that story, a bridge between two worlds struggling to coexist. As the debates around Shadow's story continued, Ethan realized that many people were grappling with broader questions about coexistence with wildlife. His experience had opened the door to conversations that went beyond hybrids, touching on deforestation, urban sprawl, and the loss of natural habitats. Shadow had become a symbol, not just of adaptation, but of the challenges humanity faced in preserving the natural world. One recurring topic was the increasing number of wildlife encounters in suburban and urban areas. Ethan's readers frequently shared stories of coyotes prowling neighborhoods, bears raiding trash cans, and deer wandering through backyards. These interactions, while fascinating, often led to conflict. People were unsure how to respond. Some feared for their safety, while others wanted to protect the animals. Ethan decided to dedicate a series of blog posts to this issue. Drawing on his experience with Shadow, he emphasized the importance of understanding and respecting wildlife behavior. Wild animals aren't invading our spaces, Ethan wrote. We're encroaching on theirs. The best way to coexist is to recognize that they have just as much right to these lands as we do. The series resonated deeply, sparking a surge of engagement. Readers shared practical tips, like securing trash cans to deter scavengers and planting native vegetation to create safer habitats. Ethan worked with Dr. Grant to compile these ideas into a free guide, titled Living in Harmony with Wildlife. The guide quickly gained traction, becoming a resource for communities seeking to reduce conflicts and foster coexistence. At the same time, Ethan faced criticism from certain quarters. Some argued that his story romanticized hybrids and failed to address the potential dangers they posed. One particularly harsh critic accused him of being irresponsible for releasing Shadow, suggesting that hybrids could threaten native species or become aggressive toward humans. Ethan addressed these concerns head-on in a public Q&A session hosted on his blog. "I understand the fears surrounding hybrids," he said, "but Shadow was never a threat. He was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. The solution isn't to fear these animals, but to address the root causes of their existence. That starts with protecting their habitats and giving them the space to thrive." This response struck a chord with many, shifting the conversation toward proactive solutions. Wildlife corridors, which allowed animals to move safely between fragmented habitats, became a focal point of discussion. Dr. Grant joined forces with Ethan to advocate for these corridors, highlighting their benefits for both wildlife and humans. Together, they raised awareness through articles, interviews, and community events. Shadow's story, once a personal journey, had grown into a movement. Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. Though Shadow was no longer by his side, his impact continued to ripple outward, inspiring change and sparking conversations that might one day make the world a better place, for animals and humans alike. As the conversations around Shadow's story grew, Ethan began to see the profound impact one animal could have on shifting perspectives. Shadow was no longer just a hybrid who had wandered into his life. He was a symbol of the interconnectedness between humanity and nature. Ethan's blog had transformed from a personal journal into a hub for wildlife enthusiasts, conservationists, and everyday readers seeking to understand their place in the natural world. The most emotional responses came from those who saw their own struggles reflected in Shadow's story. Parents wrote about teaching their children the value of compassion through Ethan's posts. Animal rescuers shared how Shadow's journey inspired them to continue their work despite challenges. Even skeptics, initially critical of Ethan's decisions, admitted that Shadow's story had made them think differently about coexistence. One reader wrote, "Ethan, your story about Shadow changed the way I see the world. I used to think wild animals were just problems to be managed, but now I realize they're part of the same ecosystem we belong to. Shadow showed me that love and respect can extend beyond our species. Thank you for sharing him with us." Messages like these reinforced Ethan's belief that Shadow's departure had meaning beyond personal loss. By choosing to let Shadow go, Ethan had done more than free a wild animal. He had created a story that bridged the gap between humans and the natural world. Meanwhile, Ethan continued collaborating with Dr. Grant and other conservationists to raise awareness about hybrids and their unique challenges. Together, they launched a documentary project called Between Worlds, chronicling Shadow's story alongside similar cases of hybrid animals. The documentary explored themes of adaptation, survival, and the complex relationships humans share with nature. When the film premiered at a local wildlife conservation festival, It drew an overwhelming response. Viewers were moved by the raw emotion of Ethan's narration, the stunning visuals of the wilderness, and the underlying message of hope. By the end of the event, donations had poured in for wildlife sanctuaries and conservation programs, demonstrating the tangible impact of Shadow's legacy. Years later, Ethan still thought of Shadow often. The forest no longer felt empty. It was alive with memories and the echoes of Shadow's presence. Ethan continued to hike the trails, photograph the wildlife, and write about the ever-evolving relationship between humans and nature. One crisp autumn evening, as Ethan walked by the stream where he had last seen Shadow, he paused. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the water. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a shadowy figure watching him from the tree line. The figure didn't move, and Ethan knew better than to approach. Instead, he raised a hand in silent acknowledgement, a gesture of gratitude and respect. Whether it was Shadow or another creature of the wild didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, the unspoken bond that tied them together across time and space. As Ethan turned to leave, a faint howl echoed through the forest, carried on the wind like a distant song. Ethan smiled, his heart full. Shadow's story had come full circle, and so had his own.